Hello to everyone. Welcome. We're excited to have you here. We're Anton and John from Sonic Minds, a sonic branding agency based in Copenhagen. Before my colleague John will start his webinar, I just want to introduce sort of this platform here and show you that throughout this webinar you'll all be able to ask questions, and you can do so by clicking. It's actually, the icon has just updated, but right here in the bottom right corner of the call, there's this little grid of buttons. If you click on that, you can ask questions throughout the webinar, and then we will have a Q&A afterwards where we will take as many questions as we can answer within the time we've allocated. John is I think I'll let John introduce himself, but welcome.
Hello. Welcome. Thanks, Anton. Yeah, so I'm John. I'll be doing the webinar today. I'm a creative lead and UX and UI specialist, actually, at Sonic Minds. I'm also a musician, just so you know, performing artist as well, sound designer. I create countless UI sounds, countless. So it's really a geeky place here at Sonic Minds. But it's lovely to have you all here. So what we're doing today is we're kicking off a webinar series, actually. So it's a 3-part series. Today is, as you can see, UI sound webinar. What makes a great UI sound? Part 1. So we're actually going to have part 2 and part 3, like I said. But today, essentially, we're going to discuss everything, and there's a lot, trust me, that goes into making a great UI sound. Hopefully you're all either UXers, sound designers, product specialists, whatever it might be, right? But hopefully you can take a lot from this and use in your own cases and scenarios. So sound is a super powerful thing, right? I think you just being here and signing up tells me that you actually know how powerful sound and music actually is. But it's often overlooked, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, and typically an add-on at the end of the design process. But what I actually want to do is inspire you to employ it earlier on in the design process, from the beginning. So we're going to talk about how to do that and how to actually make a great UI sound. As Anton said, you can flick over to the Q&A bubble and ask your questions. So the agenda for today, it's not too long, but I'll still give you an agenda. We're going to start with why UI sounds. Why are they important, right? The bigger picture. Then we'll talk about types of UI sounds. I'm going to make sounds with my mouth and perhaps my hands and arms, and maybe even play you some real sounds as well. And then we'll dive into the puzzle. It sounds mysterious because it is mysterious, but I'll kind of unravel it for you. And then we'll give you some tools on where to start at the end. So where you can actually start to employ these tools in your experiences, user experiences. So sound is, as I said, highly emotional, right? It brings us back to certain places. Sometimes, you know, earlier times in our life, it's highly nostalgic. It fills us with emotions, feelings, perhaps even memories. So sound isn't just heard, it's felt. Very cool. I think this is an extremely well-made track. It's got a bit of swing. It's quite nice. But it's just to say, right, you didn't just hear that, right? You probably all felt something. Maybe you thought of somebody. I didn't even play Super Mario Brothers or whatever it's called, but I still have a connection to this song, right? Maybe that's to the power of pop culture. I don't quite know. But it's just to say that it's highly emotional, sound and music, right? We instantly all had a certain emotion, feeling, perhaps memories. So it's very powerful. Although sound is, yes, it's emotional and intuitive, but it's actually quite scientific and analytical. You can break down music and sound and UI sounds for that case. You can break it down by acoustics, physics even, harmony, melody, rhythm, and much, much, much more. So it is quite scientific and you can analyze it. And that's actually what I want to talk about today, is less the emotional aspect. I'm going to get back to the emotional aspect in the coming webinars, part 2, part 3. But what I want to dive into today is this scientific and analytical aspect of UI sounds. So generally, UI sounds, they do two things. First of all, they provide emotional stimulation, like I just mentioned. So they ignite our emotions, right? Hopefully you all felt that with that little sound example there. That's one thing they do. But in parallel, at exactly the same time, UI sounds, they actually make interactions easier. They improve usability, they improve functionality. And this is actually the scientific and analytical part about UI sounds, which I'm going to dive into today. Super, super fascinating stuff. So there's two things you can consider when making UI sounds, really. First of all is the type of sound, and I'm really boiling it down now for you. So first thing to consider when making a great UI sound is the type of sound. I'll dive into this in the webinar today, and actually a lot in the coming part 2, part 3. But the type of sound is, you know, the timbre, the texture of the sound, the attributes. Is it a cool sound? Is it luxurious? Is it scientific? Not scientific. That's it could be, but perhaps sci-fi or something, right? That's the type of sound. What instrument is it? So on and so forth. But actually, aesthetics, they aren't always the right answer. It's not just about making a cool sound. It's also about taking into account the environment that sound is actually heard in. You know, design is about designing for real world situations, not just for our studio listening environments. I think we sometimes forget this. I certainly do sometimes. I think all designers forget this. And we have to remind ourselves, good UI sounds or good UI is designed for real world use, right? Something that actually works in the context in which it's going to be in, or be heard in at least. So next up, why do you need UI sounds? Why do we need them, right? First of all, gain control over the first moment. By that, I mean, you can actually, you know, if you're a physical product or a user experience or whatever it might be, you can actually gain control via UI sounds over that first user interaction, that first touch point. Apple, for example, we all know and love Apple. If you turn on or you unbox your Apple iMac and you turn on your laptop or whatever it might be, it comes with this really awesome big C major chord. Dong. We all know and love it, the Apple sound, right? But they really gain control that first moment. It's very smart. It's very an emotional moment. You know, it kind of, but it also ties into their brand, right? It's kind of minimalist sound, very clean, simple, all these kinds of things. So you can gain control over that first unboxing moment. That's one really crucial thing that sound can do that other things can't do so much. But also UI sounds, they give you a product, if it's a product or an app or whatever it might be, they give it a voice, right? You spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, if it's physical product, thinking about the materials, you know, is it leather, right? How does leather sound? We can actually match that in sound. But what about wood? You know, is it metal, aluminium for Apple or whatever it might be? That's one thing. What about the color scheme, perhaps? You know, there's all the thoughts go into the design behind how it looks and how it feels. But how does it sound? Who is it? Who is the product, right? We can actually give a personality and a character to your product or app or whatever it might be. What's its voice sound like? What's its accent? Is it Australian like me with a kind of accent that you're hearing now? Or is it Danish? Or is it a language we don't even know of? Is it alien? Is it, you know, I don't know, right? That's the exciting part. You can decide, and you decide according to your brand, how your brand should sound. What's the voice of your brand, right? So that's a question for you. How do you think your product sounds if it had a voice? And that's actually a nice question to ask when creating good UI sounds. So why UI sounds so important? For brands, for stakeholders, for users, for everybody involved, I would say there's kind of 4 things I broke down personally that I found throughout our experience here at Sonic Minds. There's 4 really important factors to do with why UI sounds matter so much or improve user experience. First is functionality. First and foremost, I would say, is functionality. UI sounds improve functionality, usability on a basic level. So they communicate, you know, sound communicates meaning on a very subconscious level. We don't really think about it so much, but it can actually communicate actions and improve the usability. Much like, you know, if you have a, I've even got one on my screen right now, but if it's telling me that a webinar has started, but, you know, if you get a calendar, a reminder, a notification, it might come with a sound, a notification sound. Now that's improving the functionality. I use it all the time. It helps me a lot, and it guides my attention towards that, saying, hey, John, a webinar has started. Fantastic. I better jump in, right? So it's just to say it can really improve functionality, and we'll dive into that a lot today. Next up is personality. It improves, or it gives character to your product, like I just mentioned a slide ago. So you can, this is where you really tie in the brand fit, you know, like the UI sound can really fit your brand. Is it green suede or whatever it might be? How does your brand, who is it? Who is the character, right? And with this, we look into matching the visuals, the product design, physical product design, or the materials you use, or the color scheme. I think PlayStation is a fantastic example here of really strong personality with their startup sounds. When you power up a PlayStation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they have really cool power on sounds, and they just totally put you in that mood and give you that personality. You understand who that is. You know, it's very Japanese, it's cold, it's blue, it's cool, all those kinds of things. Next most important thing is visibility. So UI sounds actually increase your brand awareness and brand recognition overall. Think of Apple, right? The UI sounds, we all know and love them. They really increase your brand awareness about who Apple is. We hear them everywhere, and we know a lot of, it tells us a lot about that brand. And ultimately this kind of builds trust, right? Some other examples of this, UI sounds creating a lot of visibility or brand awareness is Netflix, the startup ta-dum sound, really cool, or the Windows startup sound, so on and so forth. And finally, a very important thing, last but not least, is accessibility. And I've written inclusion here in front of you. So audio allows yet another medium of communication, right? Not just visual, not just haptic, although haptic is strong, but audio provides us another form of communication. So imagine for visually impaired people, you have visuals, okay, but then you have haptics. Yes, that helps. But what if by haptics, I mean vibrations, sorry. But what if I'm away from my device and I don't receive the visual feedback or the haptic feedback? There is a perfect example of where audio comes in, right? In Australia, we have a really loud sound for when you cross the street as a pedestrian. There's a sound telling you, for the visually impaired, that it's safe to cross now, right? And that's a super crucial sound, and it's really quite a cool sound, actually. I should bring that next time. Now, why are UI sounds? What do they do? There's kind of two things they do. I'm harking back to the beginning now. So again, they have that emotional aspect, which is this aesthetic side. But they also convey the intended meaning, the functional side, and that's what I'm diving into now. So when implementing UI sounds, you can actually ask yourself, if you are to implement sounds into your product or experience or whatever it may be, you can ask yourself these two questions. If you see on the diagram in front of you, there's the user on the left interacting with the user interface of the product, right? And as a user or a creator, you can ask yourself these two questions. First up, do I like the sound at the bottom? Do you literally like the sound? You should like the sound. It should be pleasing. It should fit the brand. Do I like it? Do I like the feel? But you should also ask yourself, do I understand the sound? Do I actually understand what it's trying to communicate to me? Because if the answer is no, you're doing something wrong. But I want to dive into that question now. Do I understand the sound? And by that, I mean functionality, to improve the usability and functionality. And harking back to the beginning, that's the scientific and analytical part of sound, which is super exciting. So to do that, I'm going to start by give you an overview of some types of UI sounds, some categories and families that you can start to organize. Okay, there's these different types of sounds, right? So first up, there's kinds of two families in a way you could divide it by. There's the skeuomorphic, and then there's the abstract. By skeuomorphic, I mean the real world representations of a sound. So most functions have a real world representation that you can tap into. So for example, if you have, you're dragging a file into a trash can or a bin on your computer, that action of throwing something into the bin actually has a real world skeuomorphic representation. I hope you all heard that, by the way. I assume you did. I'll play it one more time, but you can hear it's like paper crumbling, right? So this is a real world, okay, nice to see you can all hear. This is a real world representation that you can tap into. This is fantastic to use skeuomorphic references, real world references, because they're super easy to understand. I think all of you understood that action of throwing something into the trash can, right? And wherever you are in the world, you can probably understand that, right? Super easy to understand and recognize. Whereas the issue with this is that it doesn't, it's not so versatile. You can't do much with this sound, right? It's just paper crumbling. Like you can't say, oh, what about premium paper crumbling? Or what about budget paper crumbling, right? It's kind of hard to, you can't change it around a bit or fit it to your brand so much, right? Whereas that's why we use abstract sounds quite a lot actually, which are very powerful. So by abstract, I mean, how would you think throwing something in a trash can on an abstract level, how would that sound in, say, a melodic way? So one way it could sound is by going, if you throw something across the room, you go, okay. So I'll actually play you a sound to back up my sound there. Right, it's kind of going down into the trash can. So this is quite interesting because it's very versatile. It's quite a funny sound, that one, but you could actually make a version of that which is luxurious, believe it or not. You could make a version of that which is budget, or you can make a version of that which is whatever your brand is, right? So it's super versatile. You can do a lot with that. But the issue with it is that you have to learn that action. The first time you hear that, I described it to you so you knew what it was. But the first time you hear that sound, you don't know what it is probably, but very quickly you associate it with throwing it in a trash can, and voila, you know what the sound is. It's quite quick. So these are the two families, abstract and skeuomorphic. Then you have we have kind of visual tools we use, which you can try to employ yourself. I call this one the role of a sound. So if you see on this spectrum in front of you, we have on the left informative sounds and on the right atmospheric sounds. And then I've placed some kind of example sounds beneath, but you could place your own sounds on this spectrum. So on the left, we have the sound fire alarm. You can see the bottom left. That's a highly informative sound. It's telling you, get out of the building now, otherwise you're compromising your safety. It ain't good, right? Super informative and functional. And actually, you don't really want to inject so much aesthetic into that. You don't, it's a bit silly to make a premium fire alarm, right? You don't want to do that. You just want to say, no, this is highly informative. I just get straight to the point. Next up, going towards the right, we have alarm clock. This is a super informative sound, a timer going off or hello, wake up. So quite important, or at least I hope so. But you can actually start to inject a little of the aesthetic in, the brand identity. Then if you go towards the right, you see notification. Notifications we need. These are the ones that typically are audio only. They notify you from across the room, right? So because we need them, you can actually add quite a lot of brand identity or into that, right? Then power on, it's moving towards the aesthetic side now, because power on, it's not so informative. Typically, when you power on a product, you do it yourself, you instigate it, right? Typically of some sort. So it's not super informative, but it is quite aesthetic. It's saying, hey, welcome to this place. I'm putting you in a mood. And then all the way on the right, you have pure atmospheric or aesthetic sounds, which have no function whatsoever. They're not informing you of anything. They're just saying, well, they actually have emotional function, funnily enough. They have a lot of emotional function. I'm going to put you in a mood, but it's not informing you of anything, right? So that's a nice spectrum you can use to kind of start to map out your sounds. Then I'm going to talk about four categories of sounds. So the first family or category of UI sounds are hero sounds. These are the big sounds, the important sounds, the larger sounds in the user experience. Because they are larger and really emotionally impactful, you want to use them quite sparingly, these sounds, and quite strategically, so you can really maximize that impact when it does arrive, right? Some examples of these hero sounds could be starting up, powering on an app, perhaps winning a game. I might have an example for you of winning a game. Maybe. Right? Cute little sound, but it's an example of a hero sound. Completion of all tasks is another example. Meditation complete is another example, so on and so forth. Next up category is notification sounds. We all know these sounds. These are the ones you probably hear the most. It's the ting on your iMessage or the Google Calendar I was talking about earlier, whatever it is. These are unavoidable sounds, so we can actually just push so much brand identity into these sounds. Some examples of these sounds are, receiving text messages, download process complete, ringtones and alarms are news and updates. One interesting thing with notification sounds, which I think is worth saying here, is they're typically high-pitched in nature. So like this, you can hear it's ding, ding, high-pitched. It's kind of skeuomorphic, this sound, actually, when you hear it. It's a little bit like, I think of you're at a wedding or something and someone's, clanging a glass ready for a speech or something like that. It's getting your attention immediately, right? It's very short, snappy, but it's quite high-pitched. And that's because, well, the reason why they do that at weddings is to cut through the ambient, people just saying stuff, whatever, to cut through. But the reason is because high frequencies or high pitch and high frequency is two sides of the same coin. But it's just to say that we can locate those sounds. So humans with our ears, we can easily locate high frequency, high pitch sounds, but not low pitched. So it's just one thing to remember. That's why notification sounds are always chime-like, bell-like, dingy, and high pitch like that. Next category of sound is the most important, system sounds. Really exciting stuff. I love these sounds. The funny thing about these sounds are they're the most generic, actually, of all the sounds, and the shortest and least designed in a way. But the reason they're most important out of all the categories is they really define the feel of a product. These are like, if you have a device, like, I'm going to keep using this device, but if you have a device, LED screen or capacitive touch or whatever it might be, there's no real push or tangibility to the button, right? But with sound, you can actually create that feel. You can add tangibility or physicality, the feel of physicality to your product. Then you have to ask yourself, okay, how does that button sound? Perhaps we should do a webinar one time on buttons alone. I think I could definitely get into that. But anyway, it's just to say that these sounds, the system sounds, the buttons, the confirming and declining sounds, the menu navigation sounds, the error messages, all of these more smaller system sounds, or the tapping on the iPhone, or any phone, a smartphone, you have these, what do you even call that? Letter tapping. I forget the name right now, sorry. But it really adds the tangibility to the experience, right? Some examples could be like this. I'll play it again. Right? Kind of generic in a way, really short, straight to the point, but also it gives you a feel. It's gives you a nice little tactility or physicality to the sound. State changes are also a nice example of system sounds. Then lastly, we have ambient sounds. These are the ones that are purely aesthetic and immersive, and they really just put you in a certain mood. That's they have emotional function, not diagnostic function of any sort. So they put you in a certain emotion, feel, mood, perhaps a relaxing state. But these are really important because they immerse you, right? So these are the power on, power off sounds if they're gentle, just saying, hey, welcome to my space, welcome to this experience. Perhaps music, ambience in the background of a meditation app. Weather sounds could be another example. Pairing music, so on and so forth. Pairing like Bluetooth pairing. So you can ask yourself in regards to ambient sounds, what emotion do you want to evoke in your users? And then these sounds are a response to that question. What emotion do I want to calm my users and put them into a calming, safe space? I might have an example for you. Then, well, that's like pairing music, right? Put you into a mood. Oh, okay, nice, relaxing. You can ask yourself, what emotion do you actually want to evoke in your users, right? Then the next category of sound isn't actually sound at all, funnily enough. It's silence. But actually at Sonic Minds, we really preach using silence, which is a bit funny now that I think about it. But in all seriousness, you have to sometimes think when silence is the right answer. Sound isn't always the right answer. Sometimes silence does the job better, right? So it's not just about adding more sound all the time. It's actually knowing when to use sound and when not to use sound. And the great brands with the UI, they do this well. Apple, Tesla, even Duolingo. I'm not sure if I'll get some thumbs down or thumbs up here. I assume it's a bit of a touchy subject, Duolingo, but silence is really, really important. Sound should not just it should never detract from the experience, right? It should always elevate the experience, make it better and enhance. It should never go against. So some examples of when to use silence obviously should be when you have actions that require privacy or discretion for obvious reasons, or when users don't want interruptions during the day. Use common sense here. If you don't want to be interrupted at that moment, perhaps your user doesn't as well. Bigger actions that are performed really frequently. So you remember those hero sounds earlier, which have a lot of sound. If they're super frequent, then perhaps don't have sound. You know, if a sound is playing 100 times a day, ask yourself, do we need a sound for this anymore, actually? Then I actually, just before we move on, I want to talk about two things. First of all is a bit of a mantra of mine. I have many, but this is one of them. Positive interactions generally can have more sound, I would say. Now, this is debatable, but it's a rule that you can generally follow and it will work for you. So the more positive the interaction, the more sound you can give. The longer the sound, the more designed, the more beautiful. You can play a symphony. No, you can't. You can't play a symphony, but you can play a lot, right? Whereas negative interactions generally should have less sound. By less sound, I don't mean no sound. Negative interactions, you're still communicating a function, right? A certain function or an action. But by less sound, I mean shorter, perhaps more to the point, maybe less designed. Whereas, you know, negative interactions, they still actually need sound. I think one good example here in Denmark, we're in Copenhagen, by the way, but in Denmark, we have this transport system, the metro, the train. When you check in at the train, you have a card with money on it, credit card of some sort, a transport credit card. And when you check in with that, if you don't have enough money to check in, it kind of gives you this like, wah, wah, you know, this kind of, you don't have enough money, but it's super loud actually. So if you're in main station, central Copenhagen, and you tap in and you don't have enough money, it audio shames you. It looks at you and says, you know, you don't have enough money. That's kind of an example of, okay, maybe that was too much sound, right? Maybe, yes, maybe you need sound, but it could be less negative. It could be more neutral, maybe less loud, something else than that, because it's quite funny. If you do travel to Copenhagen, you have to check that out. If it's still there, maybe it's not there in the future. And then I just want to talk about, lastly, on this section, annoyances. When do we get annoyed by sound? I think that's something that people think about and wonder. When does sound get bothersome, right? When does it bother us? Generally, if you're confused by the sound you hear, that's not good. So yeah, that's quite bothersome, right? So always make sure, this really ties into the functionality. You really have to spend a lot of time and effort making sure that the sound is uniquely paired to the action. When they're too long, it's not good. Too loud, or even too quiet if it's a busy environment, right? So just be aware of those if it's too loud, too quiet, or too long. Cool. I hope that all makes sense. It's a lot of talking. I'm going to make some more sounds now as well, but I want to dive into the puzzle. What I mean by the puzzle is this functionality thing. How do we pair an action with a sound so that the sound communicates that action, that function? So I think of it like a puzzle. This is how we do it, at least, and it works for us. If you imagine you get a jigsaw puzzle, right? You blow off the dust, you haven't done it in ages, you throw it on the table, all the pieces scatter across the table. All those individual random pieces are like your sounds, right? They're just scattered across the table. Then what you have to do is typically when I do a jigsaw, I'll start to group by colors, perhaps. Oh, there's some blues, I'll group them together, pinks, purples, or maybe you find the corners if it's a square jigsaw puzzle. Here's a corner. So you start to make sense of the randomness, right? You group them together with these logical relationships. That's actually exactly what we do with sound. We have all the functions, they're scattered across the table. Then we start to say, are there some logical relationships here, actually, where we can start to pair up sounds? So for example, you take one of the piece, by piece I mean sound function, power on, and you say, actually, that looks quite closely to power off. Okay, I'll put them together. There's one logical relationship, and so on and so forth. And you do this mapping, so to say, across all the pieces until you finally have this kind of cohesive image. And it doesn't look like individual random pieces anymore. It looks like one picture, one jigsaw puzzle, right? And that's the end game of good UI soundscape, is that one holistic picture. As you can see in front of you with this beautiful diagram. This is kind of, the diagram in front of you is kind of what it would look like at the end, what I mean by the end picture. So this is an audio hierarchy, we call it, architecture. And this is the end game. So we've sorted them all into their groups and families here, you can see. Whether it's notification on the right, we sort all the notifications together, so on and so forth. But we also start to find their logical relationships to each other. And we say, okay, which sounds should inherit from other sounds? So they all actually start to, oh, when I heard this sound, it actually has the same function as that sound, which means they're both positive. And you see what I mean? You start to kind of subconsciously, intuitively understand the function behind the sound. If you do this mapping correctly, it's quite a puzzle though. So, as I said at the beginning, sound is the most emotional tool in your toolbox. I don't know if I said that actually, but I kind of said it. But it is, trust me, sound is much more emotionally impactful than any other medium. I'm not biased at all, it just is. But what does functionality, the other hand, not emotion, what does functionality actually mean in sound? I don't know, let's dive into it now. So good functionality essentially is having clear mappings. That's a little bit what I showed you on the puzzle before, right? Mapping them together, the architecture. Finding these logical relationships between the sound itself and the function, the action. So rather than sound, let's talk about visuals, because that's always easier than talking about air molecules vibrating in the air. Sound, sorry. But let's talk about visuals. So, okay, a bad mapping is something you can see here on the right of the screen. And do look at this if you're listening right now. It's kind of interesting. So this is a stovetop, like above your oven, right? Some of you might know this, but it's fascinating. So, okay, if it were me, I'll just walk through it myself. If this were me, I would take the bottom left dial, the temperature dial of the stovetop, you understand? And I would say, okay, that correlates to the top left stovetop. Great. I don't know if some agree. Then I would say the second to left temperature dial at the bottom, I would say, okay, is the bottom left. I don't know if you, actually, I'm super interested. I'm getting some thumbs down. That's really interesting. That's fancy. That's actually great. You're doing thumbs down because it's proving my point. But it's just to say that, okay, great. So if bottom left, top left, second to bottom left is the bottom right. What happens on the right now? Is it the same? Is it symmetrical? Or is it, nice, Anton, setting up a poll. Fantastic. Is it flipped? Is it mirrored? Is it inverted? I don't know. No one knows. And the weird thing is we actually see these designs everywhere. I actually think my stovetop at home is like this. Whereas what's a good mapping, right? A good mapping would be like this. Yes, it looks like spider eyes, I realize now, but this is a really good mapping. I think wherever you are across the globe, planet Earth, you would understand which temperature dial correlates to which stovetop. Super nice, really well done. I've never seen this in real life, funnily enough. Yeah, it's just weird that it's so obvious. Once you see it, you think, oh, okay, it's so obvious. Okay, so that was mapping, right? Good mapping, bad mapping. How do we actually approach this in sound? It's a good question. Let's dive into that. So what we do is we look around us I'm looking around right now, and we're trying to find symbols and counterparts in the real world. What I mean by symbols is symbols of communication. So you have to look around yourself when creating a sound and say, okay, is there sounds from our daily lives that we can actually tap into? Sounds that already mean something to us, right? So for example, knocking a door, that sound. I can do it. I'm not sure if that noise canceled or not, but if I go, 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 right? Imagine if I went to all of your doors right now, wherever you are in the world, and I knocked at the same time. First of all, that would be very crazy and yeah, quite weird. But I think you would all understand or have the same reaction, right? You would all go, whoa, who's that? I better go, check who that is at the door or whatever it is. So it's just to say that's an actual universal symbol of communication we can tap into. So either you can record that sound, literally go, 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 and use that as a UI sound. Probably not the best sounding thing ever. So then you could actually say, no, let's abstract. Going back to earlier, right? We talked about skeuomorphic and abstract sounds. Let's abstract from that and use the rhythm of it, but create a melody out of it. So da 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 or da 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 da. There's all these, it's actually fascinating. There's all these knocking rhythms around the world, right? That we kind of understand and know and love. Anyway, you can tap into those symbols of communication, right? Some other symbols could be crumbling paper, which we talked about earlier. A police siren, you can tap into that for critical alert. We all know the sound of a police siren. The sound of a police siren is actually like that for very specific physical or acoustic reasons. I won't go into that, but it's quite fascinating. But you can tap into that communication for alerts, right? What about speech and intonation? I'm Australian, so I go up at the end of my sentence sometimes. You hear what I mean? It's like I spoke a sentence, but I actually speak with melodies. And everyone speaks with different melodies, but there are some common kind of universal melodies like hello, dado, so you can actually tap into these universal forms of communication when creating sounds. I hope that makes sense. Suction, vacuum, things like that. Pouring water, go, 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 towards completing something. We understand that it's got to end sometime, right? Or hopefully, so on and so forth. Then what I also do is I look around nature. I'm indoors now, but I can also look around when I'm outdoors for metaphors. I'm giving you all the tricks right now. But for example, if you saw this, a raindrop. Okay, if you heard one sole raindrop, doink, that's quite an intimate experience, actually. You're probably in a cave of some sort, and one raindrop finds its way through. And so it's quite intimate. So that's one metaphor which you can tap into. Maybe it's renewal or refreshing. Water is always refreshing, right? Depending where you are in the world. What about birds? Bird song. We can hear it now in Denmark in the spring. There's beautiful bird song around us. And that really gives us the feeling of like life, yeah, freshness, morning, or like renewal, a new skin. So I can't think of what to say, but you get what I mean. It's quite symbolic. What about thunder? It's really impactful. It's got a low end. It's strong, and we typically use the symbol of thunder for strength and impact and things like that. So you can tap into that in your sound. What about wind? Right, wind. If you're standing and wind goes past, it has that. You're usually not going the same speed as wind. It usually comes past you some sort. So you can tap into that. It's the idea of movement, going past progression, transformation. So these are metaphors, right? I hope you're starting to realize. What about this? This is actually a mountain, if you can see. A mountain is a metaphor you can tap into. So you walk up a mountain towards the summit at the top. Typically, when you get there, you've achieved the goal, right? Unless you're super fit and it was super easy for you. But typically for most people, you climb up a hill, a mountain, and you achieve a goal, right? And then you're sitting at the top of the mountain and you go, cuckoo, right? As everybody does. And then you hear that echoing, right? Because it's hitting off other mountains and hills. So there's reverb and echo. So we can actually use that. Believe it or not, it does make sense. And people understand when you hear echo and reverb, that's a symbol of achievement. Then we look at finding clear counterparts around us. So if something goes up, it must come down, right? That's universal rule. Whoop, ooh, right? What about short, long? You know, if a sound is short, it could be hitting a wall. Is getting through, right? So there's another kind of counterpart you can tap into. What about opened? Wah, ooh, closed. Push, pull. I'm not going to do that. More or less amount of notes. Single notes versus multiple notes. Harmony. So just one note or harmony. Soft versus sharp. You know, these are all kind of, again, clear counterparts, A or B, these binaries that we can tap into. High or low. Spatial positioning, super important in cars. EV cars now, especially where they have Atmos systems or spatial systems where you can actually position where someone is, or left to right. You know, that's a symbol of forward movement, depending where you are in the world. What about looping sounds for waiting? That's kind of pairing, right? You're waiting for something to happen, and then when you release the loop, it's done. Then what we try to do is use direction of a melody if it's an abstract sound. So by direction, I mean, you know, if you have an ascending sound, going up, it typically signals positive movement, almost always. This is great for activation sounds, hero sounds, all those kinds of things. But likewise, then you have descending sounds. You probably just heard that sounded a bit more like deactivating, but it's also used for more negative movements, negative sounds, or deactivations, like I said. For example, you can actually always think about it like this. You can always try to embody the sound. So if your function or action is negative, maybe you can go, oh, it's oh. And you notice when you sigh, you go, oh, it always goes down. You never go, oh, you know, that's all of a sudden it's positive again, right? Or, you know, the trombone, the wop, 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 that's always going down. You would never go wop, 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 you know, then all of a sudden it's positive. It's amazing how, again, all these things are physics. It's embedded in all of us. We're actually globally, this stuff is embedded within us. Static movement. Okay, so then you can ask yourself, or if you say, John, this function I have, it's not positive, but it's also not negative. Well, then perhaps it's neutral. So then you can have a static sound, and I will actually play you just one. Like this, so you can hear what I mean. Didn't go up or down. Dun dun. And then you can kind of feel it's neither good nor bad. It's just notifying me of something, but the emotion is not good or bad. So that was a lot of talking. I hope it wasn't too much talking. I just want to say to you where to start, because I see that time is running out. Before you make the sound is actually really crucial. So where should you start if you're implementing these UI sounds? First, brand insight. What are the goals, the attributes of the brand? Is it luxury or not? Then user insights. This is super crucial. You have to remember this. What are the preferences of your users? Who's the target audience? Who are your users? Get to know them. And then you have to look into the context in which the sound is heard. So this is about understanding your users and the people you're designing for. You know, we have to design for people. We can't just force design down them, right? We have to actually make it for them. We always have to remember that with good UX. And then you have to understand the limitations before you actually make the sound. You know, yes, in a dream world, the speakers of your product would be amazing, like a hi-fi sound system. But as we all know, that's typically not the case. So you have to understand the limitations before you actually make the sound, because it will determine how to make the sound, right? Hope that makes sense. And I'll dive into some of these concepts in the coming webinars, don't worry. Then some tools for you is ask yourself, what's the function? Are there relationships between functions? How often is the sound heard? How important is it to the user? Where is the sound being heard, right? Now, I actually, I'm just going to wrap up with 5 key tips for you. And I see that we're close to ending, but I'll stay for a second for any questions if anybody has some questions. 5 key tips just to wrap us up. One sound doesn't fit all. You know, a finance app shouldn't sound like a gaming app, so you just have to make custom sounds. You can't use generic sounds across many different usage scenarios. Sound, think of sound as part of a bigger picture always. It's not just about how cool it sounds, it's about how it actually fits in the experience. Context always matters. I mentioned that on the previous slide. But think about the context. When is it heard? Is it in the morning? Therefore, perhaps people are more sensitive to the sound, right? Don't design to annoy people. Sounds obvious, but just remember that. Generally, softer sounds are more pleasing. Try to, make it a nice experience as well. And finally, strike the right balance. By that, I mean, UI sounds, should they be super stylized or should they be super functional? Well, actually, the answer is the best ones are both of those put together. It is difficult to do, but the best ones are both of those. So you can ask yourself when making the sounds, can users understand this sound intuitively? Do they understand it? And you can ask yourself, does it match our brand identity? If yes to both those questions, you've nailed it. Done deal. Yes, so that's actually all I've had. Next time, we're going to dive into a lot more how to make pleasing, cool sounds and match them with your visual identity and your app and everything. We'll dive into a lot of that emotional stuff. But I do hope you enjoyed it. I really do. I see I've gone a minute over, so just a bit too long, but thank you all for coming. I'll stay a minute for questions. And in front of you, you have some, if you have questions you'd like to ask, also take this QR code and you should be taken to my LinkedIn probably, or you can find out. And then you can, feel free, please write me and we can start a conversation.
Thank you, John. And thank you all for staying around. Hope you enjoyed this, of course. We've got so many questions coming in. I think we have around 20 questions maybe. So we'll just start with, you can all go in and actually upvote the questions that you really want to pick John's brain on. But I think I will just start with the most upvoted one. This was anonymous, but John, maybe you can answer this. For those of us without any technical skill, can you recommend some kind of builder for UI sounds, or maybe a very good library?
Okay, this is going to sound ridiculous. I'm not joking, but I'm going to have to do some research for you, believe it or not, and I can bring an answer next week for a specific library. I don't know because we create custom sounds. Help me out, Anton, if you can. So I can't tell you where to go. I know there are a few places. They escape me now, but to build up sounds, you can find libraries, do some research and use your ears. If they sound good to you, you can use them. But I would just say, beware strategically how to use them. That's kind of what I'm saying, trying to hone in, is yes, you can find a great sound, but really think about that, the meaning it conveys and matching it to the function and the action. So like I said earlier, it's not about how it sounds or the aesthetic or how cool it is. It's more, does it fit the function? So I just really want to hone that in. I don't know, Anton, if you can help with.
Maybe I can recommend a soundeffect.com.
Yes,
they have a lot of like packs of sounds you can buy for quite a good price, I gotta say. A lot of games use these, for instance, for their UI sounds. Another is something like Soundly, which is also sort of license free. You just pay for a subscription, a small subscription, and then you can drag and drop all the sounds that you need.
It's true. A sound effect, the first one would be the place to start. And I'll do some more research if you come to the next webinar.
The next question is also anonymous. It is, why do so many products sound bad?
Because we're not making them, right? No, it's a really good question. That's a huge topic, so I'll try to answer something. I think, first of all, we're tied to okay, so sounds used to come out of buzzer speakers, typically out of products. It's only in relatively recent years that it came out of, more like high, full range speakers, normal speakers, like the iPhone, right? That's a normal speaker. But sounds used to come out of buzzers. And I think that actually, this is only one of many answers, by the way, but I think that actually started to form the language of UI sounds to be very simple and sound a bit harsh and crappy. So I think that actually, you see what I mean? That was the beginning of UI sounds, happened with piezo buzzers, so to say. So that actually, informed, right, how the communication, there were a lot of limitations, I'll say that. And we've kind of confined ourselves to the limitations. So we have to follow the rule book now that we have better speakers, but also know when to break the rules. I hope that answers it. There's actually many things involved with that, to be honest.
Great. Then we've got another question here from Debjit. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. He's asking, how do you squeeze in emotions in such little time?
Fantastic question. The really cool thing is that you really can. I brought very simple sound examples today just so that we all understand what's happening. But I could have also brought sound examples that are, very emotional. How do you do it? Great question. I'm going to dive into that more. Help me out, Anton.
Big question. Yeah.
Big question. Okay, so yeah, typically sounds are very short, 1-2 seconds max, right? UI sounds. Sometimes they can be longer for the power ons, and then it's a lot easier because it's true, Debjit. The longer, the more easier to pack in emotion. But I would say then you're looking at factors like what is the relationship between, if you have 2 notes to work with, what are those 2 notes, right? So you can't pack in 10 notes into 1 second. And by notes, I mean pitches, sorry, people. So you can't say, play a whole melody. You have to actually simplify it and say, I've got to choose what are the most 2 potent pitches to choose right now. And there's a lot of science that actually goes into musical intervals, which is fascinating. I'm happy to talk about that more. But you really have to look into what's the maximum impact I can make with the least amount of tools. So yes, which pitches do you choose? Which instrument plays it? Which taps into emotion? Like piano, it's a very universal instrument, and we all kind of know the sound. It's very familiar to us. So then you can use that to tap into that familiarity. Say, this subject could be a webinar series on its own, and I will actually dive into those things, Debjit, in the coming.
Then we've got Ching Sang. Saying, hi John, fantastic knowledge, thank you. I know that you're Aussie, as you were mentioning the signal sound at the pedestrian crossing in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Hi Billie Eilish's Bad Guy. And you're living in Copenhagen.
Yeah.
Their question is, how do cultural sound preferences influence UI sound design?
Great question. I would say that they do influence sound design. So typically sound design is done more on a universally understood level. There's actually some universal things about music. A lot of things are cultural when it comes to music, intervals, scales. There's a lot that is very culturally determined or perceived. But there are some universal things, actually. Like, for example, the pentatonic scale, it's a musical scale where it's all cultures use this scale in different shapes and forms. So, there's many ways to go about that. And there are some universal intervals or relationships between pitches that do happen across cultures. You always hear in UI 5-1 or 1-5. That might not mean anything to you. That doesn't matter. I'm just saying that there's relationships that are the most common denominator across cultures that you can tap into. You can never please all cultures, as with all UI and UX. I think it's the same with designing UI, I imagine. What is up and what is down and what is left and what is right, depending where you are in the world. The same is with sound, but you can actually find common things across that try to see, please or be understood by others. I hope that answers your question. Really good questions.
Yeah, thank you all. And yeah, I hope you can stick around for just a couple more questions. There's so many good ones here. I just want to make sure I get to them. Here's an anonymous question. Hi, John. Great webinar. I was wondering how we measure the effect of product sounds.
Really good question. Fascinating. I will actually, believe it or not, I'll dive into this in part 2 or part 3 of this webinar series. But yeah, how do we make sure the sounds are working, right? If I design the sound, I think it works, but maybe I'm wrong, right? Lucky thing is, as experts, you can make kind of good judgments, good creative judgments through experience, but you never really know if a user actually experienced the sound the way you intended it, right? So then we use things like testing, audio testing, or user testing. I think this happens a lot, right, with UX, is you test with users or on product, perhaps, actually give people an app to try out, whatever it is. We do that with sound, actually. It just works differently. It's the same thing, but it works slightly differently with sound. So we actually partner with testing companies at Sonic Minds, and they're the experts in the testing. So we partner with them, and we undergo those user testings where users will listen to the sound and then kind of say, do they understand the meaning behind it? And I think just if you took one thing away from this incredibly long answer to your question, if you take one thing away, the main thing is to test the functionality, I would say. Do people understand that action has, do they understand the action? If that makes sense. Yeah, good question.
Then I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. Vivaswat is asking, could you share a bit about your practical UI sound design process? Beyond acoustic sounds, what kind of tech or software are your go-tos for creating UI sounds?
Great question again. I will actually dive again into this in the future webinars. I'm not even joking, but I'm a believer in you can use any tool to make a good sound, really. I'm not saying you need this specific tool. So I would start with a DAW, a digital audio workstation. These are like the things, Ableton, Pro Tools, Logic in Apple computers, you can get that. Reaper, there's many of them and they all do the same thing. Trust me, they all do exactly the same thing. But they're a great place to start because that's where you work with sounds. Then you can pull audio acoustic instruments in, or like you say, or ask about probably more synthesizers, I would imagine, the computer digitally created sounds. For that, you can, every synthesizer around today does the same thing, really. So if you get a digital audio workstation like Ableton or Logic, that's a great place to start. That's where you can actually use and play with the sounds. And then you can get a synthesizer. And by that, I mean, it's a digital plugin you can buy. And you can buy any of them. And if you actually buy Logic or Ableton, they have them built in already. So you can just get going. And trust me, they work. I actually use a lot of these digital audio workstations, and I use all their internal plugins as well, and their synths, they're fantastic. That's a great thing about living in today's age, is that it's quite simple to access these things. And a lot of these, Ableton, for example, they have everything built into the product. But go ahead and just start. It's all there, easy.
Great. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions, but as John said, please reach out to him on LinkedIn, scan the QR code, or find him or find any one of us at Sonic Minds, of course. You can also send us an email. In any way you really want to have find some more answers. And of course, otherwise, stay tuned for the upcoming part 2 of this series on what makes a great UI sound. So thank you all so much for joining, and have a great day.
Thank you all.